Those gentlemen are outside of the room, aren't they? Where are they going? Sorry.
No, it's okay. You've just got to switch it off.
Good, we're live and streaming. Excellent. Okay. Welcome everybody to this change in venue, Rains Park Library. We've got some apologies for the meeting today. So we've had apologies from Sarah Blow and from Josh Potter. Casey Thomas is deputising for Josh. The meeting's being recorded, so please remember to use your microphones. We're not expecting a fire drill, so if the alarm sounds, you can leave via the emergency exits. We've got no further apologies for the meeting beyond what I've said, so the meeting's quorate, and we're going to have our part 2 meeting here, and then we've got our part 1 meeting here, then we've got a part 2 meeting in the same room, so we'll need to conclude the part 1, and then ask members of the public to leave, and then we can go into part 2. We've got a few new faces, and a particular welcome to Mohan, who's joined us for your first governing body meeting. I wonder if it might just be quickly helpful for us to do a round of introductions. People could just say who they are and what their role is, so everyone knows who everyone else is. So obviously I'm Andrew Murray, the chair of the CCG.
James Murray, Chief Finance Officer for the Alliance.
David Smith, I'm the lay member for Finance and also the lay Vice Chair.
Just a reminder, you need to be using your microphones as well, so it's going to be like a little domino effect microphone button.
John Atherton, Director of Performance.
Marek Jarzębowski, local GP, Chair of LMC, non-voting member of the governing body.
Yvonne Hilton, I support this meeting.
Fraser Thames, Head of Governance.
Sam Page on the board nurse. Claire Guy, I'm the lay member, patient and public involvement.
Andrew Lee, audit, Merton.
Karen Wellington, GP.
Andrew Otley, GP, clinical lead for mental health and joint East Merton locality lead with Mohan.
Mohan Tikram, East Merton locality lead with Andy and social prescribing clinical lead.
Mike Greenberg, secondary care member for Merton.
Tim Hodgson, West Merton locality lead, GP.
James Blythe, Managing Director of the CCG.
Thank you. So the first thing we need to just cover is the declaration of interest. We've got the register of interests with the papers. Can everyone just tell me whether that's a full and accurate record of your interests, and is there anything particular anyone needs to declare for any of the items on the agenda? No, we're happy they're accurate. Good. So we need to approve the minutes of the part 1 meeting from 9th of January. So let's go through those. I'll go through them quickly page by page. So page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, page 5. Claire.
The section that talks about my asking about the quality impact assessment, it was the equality impact assessment.
Okay.
Okay.
Can we just, you can just make a note of that, Yvonne. Thank you. Page 6, page 7, page 8, and page 9. So we're happy that's an accurate record of the meeting. Yes, good. There weren't any matters arising from the meeting that we need to cover, but it's probably worth me saying that last time we didn't have time for questions. I did get a couple of questions sent to me after the meeting, which we've prepared a response to, and it's sitting in my inbox waiting to be sent out. So it will be sent out in the next 24 hours, so we'll get a response back to those questions. You'll note on the agenda today, again, there isn't a section for questions, but I am going to make time at the end in the any other business section so we can take questions from members of the public. So we're going to go on now to the first main part of the agenda, which is the update. You've got a chair's update, but I don't have anything particular to add beyond what's in James's Managing Director's update. So we'll go straight to the Managing Director update.
I'll take the report as read. Probably just the only thing I want to flag with Merton Health and Care together is for those who are at the programme board this week, I'm sure you'll agree, the huge progress being made within MHCT in terms of a really positive joint way of working from partners across the borough. It's really picking up some pace now, and we had a really positive discussion with St George's Hospital about integrating some of their strategic thinking around senior health, so elderly care services, with some of our thinking at the borough level. Just to reference the response that Andrew is going to send back to one of the questions, we also discussed at the meeting this week the next phase of engagement. So we will publish a discussion document on the local health and care plan at the end of the month. It will go to the Health and Wellbeing Board, and then there will be specific engagement exercises both on the overall discussion document, but more importantly, getting into the detail of involvement and co-production with service users about some of the things that we want to do as part of the local health and care plan. So I know that was one of the questions raised, and we will be doing that over the next 3 months. So probably worth just highlighting that. There's nothing else that I particularly wanted to raise. I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, so are there any questions for James or for myself? No? It was a comprehensive update, James.
Good.
So let's go on then to the key area of focus, which is the annual operating plan. We've got, in the agenda, we've got 45 minutes set aside for this. I propose we don't spend that much time on it because I'd like to leave a bit more time for the strategy and planning section where we look at the primary care contract and the NHS long-term plan, which I think needs a bit more discussion. But we'll go on now to the annual operating plan. So James, over to you.
So I'll introduce this and I'll bring in colleagues in turn. Under the cover sheet there are 3 papers. The first is the CCG's commissioning intentions for 2019-20. Katie will talk to these in a minute. These are for approval today. This will be followed by an update on the CCG's financial plan for 1920. So, can we afford the commissioning intentions? And given the status of where we are in the planning round, this is for noting at this point. Clearly, we are in the middle of the financial planning for the 1920 year, including negotiating all of our contracts. So, we're not able to conclude that yet. And then finally, John will talk to our proposed performance trajectories for 2019-20, and once again this is for noting because a number of key performance trajectories remain still subject to negotiation with some of our key providers. So I'll go on and hand over to Katie to talk through the commissioning intentions.
Okay, thanks James. So I'll take the report as read and I'll pull out some key themes and key points to note for the benefit of the board. So recognising that there's been a lot of work going on since the commissioning intentions were originally circulated to providers back in September, this paper pulls together the current status of where we are on the various programmes of work and the associated QIP values against each programme. I think rather than going through each programme, I'll just turn to slide 29 in the wider pack, which is the long-term plan slide, just because I think it's a useful way of framing the discussion. So it obviously outlines the key national priorities and goals that have been identified, and this was published after the commissioning intentions were initially circulated back in the autumn. So it's just a useful way of us reflecting on where we are in the programmes of work. So I think basically the headline message is that across the programmes of work that we're doing, we are supporting and contributing to all of the key objectives in the long-term plan. And I think the CCG's obviously had a lot of work underway for several years that are heading in the direction that's outlined nationally. To just talk about some of the key themes in terms of the work we're doing, I think there's probably 3 ways that I might kind of group the schemes together. The first is the sort of out-of-hospital primary care community bundle of schemes. So we've got obviously a vast range of priority areas, so ranging from the care homes work that we're taking forward to the diabetes projects recently been developed as a business case, supporting patients with multiple long-term conditions, and admission avoidance schemes, and working through the integrated locality teams to try and support people safely in the community for as long as possible. So I think there's a raft of schemes that are in the category of trying to support people to stay well and healthy for as long as possible in an appropriate setting of care. There's a second bundle that I'd categorise as well-being, empowerment, personalisation. So I think obviously a significant amount of work going on locally around mental health, particularly the procurement and mobilisation around primary mental health services, access to children's counselling services, focus on access to the wider population and targeting particular population groups as part of those services, so looking at extending to long-term conditions for primary care, mental health services, etc. And also a significant programme of work around continuing health and personal health budgets as well. And then the third category I'd probably group schemes into is around acute transformation. So we have an ambitious outpatient transformation programme with St George's, also partnering with Sutton around Epsom St Helier, trying to look at how we're delivering outpatients in a different way, so trying to move to more virtual models, looking at enhanced triage models, etc. A range of outpatient redesign programmes that are in the category of trying to move into community settings, so community ophthalmology procurement as an example of that, and then also urgent care priorities across ambulatory care, working with the Trust, implementing urgent treatment centre standards, etc. So I think all of that reflects the sort of, there's a vast array of work that we're doing. It doesn't really do it justice, but gives a flavour of some of the key programmes that are reflected in the pack. I think all of that's very reliant on strong partnership working with our colleagues across the Trust, local authorities, general practice, voluntary sector and patient groups. And I think also to note that some of these programmes of work have a reliance on interdependency between us and trusts. For example, in outpatient transformation, working collaboratively to try and deliver those goals, working mutually to try and deliver those goals. So there's an interdependency there. The final point I wanted to note was around process. So the schemes go through internal review around quality impact assessment and equality impact assessment. So that's our opportunity to obviously sense check what we're doing, hold ourselves to account for the way that we're implementing the schemes, checking that we're targeting and supporting across the wider population to access services in an equitable way. And I think there's a range of documentation that sits underneath this that the schemes go through, but some examples in my programmes of work that have come up have been good conversations happening around moving to virtual models of care in outpatients and how we best support people from protected characteristics to access the services in an equitable way. So that's just a flavour. I think there's obviously a lot to cover, but I'm happy to pause there and take any questions.
The efficiency...
Don't forget your microphone.
The efficiency figures that you give there, is that money that's recycled back into the system, or is it just part of the saving?
Are you talking about the
where you've got
figure?
Efficiencies are driven by improved care or whatever?
Yeah, so those
back in again. Or?
So they're the QIP figures. So there'll be efficiency to come out and then reinvestment back into services in alternative settings, or potentially back into, in the case of St George's, sometimes it's investing in them doing something in a slightly different way.
Let's revisit that question, Andrew, when we get to the finance submission, because what you'll see is that in order to develop we get a certain amount of money coming in, and then we have a certain number of cost pressures, and we need those efficiencies to generate a balanced position over the years. So you see the role of them within the overall financial fund.
Anything else on this part? Yeah, David.
I think it's a general question rather than specific, so I don't know who's going to pick this up, but I guess my question is around the one around capacity and capability within the organisation around this, because if I look at the detail for each of the care groups and the sort of the schemes and then the description of what they are, there is a lot in there. Now, I think it is right, there probably is, because there's a lot of transformation we're trying to do, but I mean that's got to be backed up by, are you sure that there is the capacity to be able to actually deliver what is said within this plan?
Yeah, I mean, Katie may want to comment in detail on her area. I think that what I would say in general terms is that, this is the benefit of the Merton and Wandsworth LDU. A lot of the schemes are shared with Wandsworth, so we're actually taking the same scheme forward across the two, and the ability to generate the capacity and capability across a combined commissioning population of 640,000 is significantly greater than if we were doing it just for Merton at 240,000. I think if we were just doing this for Merton, I think this was over ambitious, but actually we can afford a little bit more strength and depth in some of our teams, because we, wherever possible, run a scheme across Merton and Wandsworth, or in the case of some of the schemes in here, we're now beginning to work jointly with Sutton, say where we've got Epsom St Helier flows as well.
Oh, just to add to that also, I think some of it's about how we're working with our partners in the Acute Trust, certainly for my piece of work, in terms of, I think there's a lot in there, but some of these programmes are led by George's with our support and vice versa, so there's a bit of capacity sharing there as well.
Okay, should we go on to the next section?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So the sets of slides that you've got in front of you are actually a refresh of what has been to the last couple of governing body seminars. So some of the numbers may have changed, but I think the format and the essence within it is very similar. What you've got on, so one of the new slides though is slide 3, which I think has a helpful set out of the overall position and what the aims are around the 5-year allocations and how the system will need to work. The other new slide is on slide 6, which is an extract from the submission that we made in February, which basically shows how we're going to use the 1920 allocation across all the service lines that are in there. What this shows is that Merton's contribution to the system position is a break-even plan. So this year we're on a £1.9 million surplus, so that effectively means it's a slightly easier ask, you might say, by the fact that we're not having to deliver a surplus this year. But as I'm about to come on to, is that when you look at slide 7, this now sets out how we will take the position that we've got at the end of the year, and you'll note that there is an underlying recurrent deficit, so you'll know that I've told you this previously, but I think this addresses one of the comments that Andrew has just made around the QIP, because we have to make good that deficit before we can then move on. So those efficiencies immediately are effectively paying back the debt that we've created in this year. Now, it has helped the fact that we don't have to achieve achieve a surplus, so some of that has helped, but even after allowing for that, we're still in an underlying recurrent deficit, which on the third box along in blue from the left is £1.2 million. But on that slide you can see all of the commitments that we've had to make into the various areas, and I think the things I'd like to pull out are that the tariff uplift that is going to go to acute providers is around 3.5% that they get, so that makes a big chunk, or eats into a big chunk of the 5.6% uplift that we've had. We've got mental health investment standard, which has to be a commitment at least of 6.3%, so we're spending more than the allocation growth. And then alongside that, we've got primary care and community commitments that we also need to be doing. That, alongside investments that we need to make into the QIP plan around the transformation, means that it is a challenging year ahead of us. We haven't actually managed to get the contracts finally negotiated as yet, which is one of the reasons why this is here at the moment for noting. We're hoping that we're going to be making good progress over the next couple of weeks, but it's going to probably take us until the end of the month to get all of this finalised. So, to note, the QIP level is around the 11.5. Now that's now gone slightly higher than what we originally thought. We thought we were around about 9.5 million, but because of the underlying recurrent position, we've had to up that, and we're within about £1 million of identifying that. Just in terms of the governance process from here, so what we're going to ask is that the Finance Committee in March looks at the financial plan and approves that for sign-off. What we'll then do is bring the financial plan for sign-off by the governing body back in May, as long as the auditors are happy for us to hold it off until May. Now, I've still to have the conversation with them. If we have to we will carve out some time in the governing body seminar in April and do that in public if we need to get the approval through. So I'm happy to pick up any questions on that.
Any questions on that section? Mike?
Just, I guess, following on from Andrew's question and your presentation, and I know it's the national desire really to reduce outpatient, I think, by 20%, and so that loss of income from the acute providers, is that going to be picked up by the uplift in coming to them, or are there difficult conversations ahead there?
So the difficult conversations are happening at the moment. That is the one thing that we've got to grapple with, is how so what we need to make as savings effectively hits the cost base of the provider. So we've got to find the sweet spot where we're able to do the transformation work, do the investment, but also covers the provider costs. And this movement to a system position, so we're no longer planning just for Merton, we're planning on the basis of the system overall. If the provider is left with a problem, that's equally our problem as well. So that's all being considered, and that's one of the reasons why we've got a bit of a delayed process around acute contract negotiation, but it is absolutely all being considered.
And James, you're looking at this across South West London. Do you want to come in?
Yeah. So I think just to sort of move the discussion, just build on what Neil's just said, really, is we're now starting to see the sea change really in how we're managed and how we need to operate as a system. So for this year, for the first time, rather than NHSI dealing with the providers and NHSE dealing with the commissioners, we sit down in a room as an STP. So we had our first review meeting on Monday, where we sat down with both representatives of NHSI and NHSE, and we had representatives from the provider and ourselves in the room. And I guess my line on this at the moment, although it hasn't quite said in this, is if one doesn't balance, you all don't balance. So we're having some quite detailed discussions now through providers and commissioners about how do we get into a position on the sort of organisational basis, how do you work that on the local system basis, so that you're working locally well together, and where there are problems, how do we manage that on a system basis. As you can imagine, that's quite a big cultural change for having had 20 years of working in an internal market environment. So we're expecting to change some of this thinking quite quickly, and what they're really focusing on is what I call the pound out of the door rather than the pound that swishes around the system. So what we'll really be focusing on over the next few weeks, apart from getting the contracts, as Neil highlighted, is where does that really reduce cost, and we're not leaving bits of the system with a problem, exactly as you described there, Mike, because we're not allowed to do that anymore. So that's how we're operating. It makes it more complicated. I've had some good discussions locally, and I've got a meeting with the chief execs next week to go through where we think we are. But let's not delude ourselves. There's going to be some tough conversations to get us over the line over the next few weeks and that.
Karen, then Claire.
Can I just ask, how does that model fit then with the fixed costs that must be in the system? Say if you're a provider, you obviously have fixed costs around running your organisation. So do you have a feel for what proportion of the costs are fixed and can't be
So you're working almost on 2 or 3 levels there. So you're trying to work out what's the right thing to do, because that's what you want to do. Second, where does that save costs in the short term, which ought to come out of the deliverable. The third then is what do you do about your structural cost base, as you've highlighted. And if that meant, for example, that you needed to get, the only way you'll get rid of that is by making something smaller. It's the time span by which you do that, and that takes a little bit more time. Now, obviously, the problem we always have is they want the money all saved today, when we know in practice we can't always get out of those costs straight away. But that's going to be part of the trick of how we manage that, not just next year, but over the coming years, because we know the long-term plan wants us to work differently, and that's going to mean some infrastructure change, and that's going to be quite a challenge for us to work through.
Claire?
I suppose my question is just how realistic are the QIP plans? I mean, how are we actually going to be able to deliver them, because they are pretty huge, aren't they?
I'll start. So, I mean, I think that we normally find that there's a range of outcomes on QIP within the year. We normally find that some things overperform, some things perform as expected, some things underperform, and we're normally trying to find a few mitigations in the year where we've got things that underperform. I think that in relative proportion to other QIP plans, certainly in South West London, it's higher than Wandsworth, possibly higher than Kingston, but much lower than Sutton and Richmond. So actually, in relative terms, we're about in the middle of the pack. And I think the work that we've done over a couple of years to kind of improve, although we've got a small underlying deficit to improve the financial health of the CCG, means that we can set realistic QIP this year. I don't think it will all go perfectly according to plan, but I think that actually there is reasonable capacity and capability and a reasonable sense of realism behind most of the plans. I think the area that I would highlight as being of greatest risk, and this is something that the governing body might want to think about quite carefully, is our dependency on others. So particularly where we have a dependency on, say, an acute hospital to deliver a set of plans, that's probably the thing that most worries me as a risk around delivering the financial value of some of this, because we really have to be aligned as a system in the way that James has outlined in doing it and committing our management resource and effort to doing it, and collaboration of that type and everyone committing to something in the same way is sometimes not easy. So I think that generally in terms of the achievability, it's kind of in the middle of the pack, and I think there'll be some pluses and minuses, but I think that's the significant risk and is always the case with this kind of plan. I think if we didn't have that kind of dependency on other partners and we were working sort of in isolation on a savings plan, I think we'd be doing the wrong thing anyway though. So in a way you just kind of have to kind of get on with it.
So let's take the final question from Dagmar.
Yeah, mine is a little bit back to James. So it is quite a sea change, the working with all the folks around the table, and I think really promising to co-produce and manage what we really want. My question is related to possible ripple on and knock-on effects on other partners' costs, and particularly as we want to integrate health and social care, absolutely must for the patient. At what point will we have some social care finance people at least starting to sit around the table so that we can get the real system approach?
I mean, they're welcome to come to the table whenever. They have to bring their money with them is always the example. But I think it'll be different for each system. So when we get onto later discussions, I think how place evolves, we'll need to mirror how relationships are and move on. But certainly that's a conversation I think we need to have sooner rather than later. We have got contacts into local authority. Unfortunately, our main contact's just left, so we're having to rebuild some of those relationships, as you know. But it is something we'll need to look through. But you know there's a lot of challenges around that in terms of culture and all that sort of thing. But it is something we're looking to get to.
Yeah, as a commitment for the governing body, I think it's quite important to at least raise.
I think I probably should just say that, of course, we would never do anything that cost shifted between sectors as well. And I think one of the challenges when thinking about the medium-term financial prospects of a health and care system and thinking about that across health and social care is that, of course, social care currently has very little idea about its income streams beyond 2021, and I think that whatever we can do to get some clarity around that will be very helpful. Sadly, it's slightly lacking at the moment.
Yeah, did you just want to respond as well?
Just to hopefully give something positive. So there's a local borough estates working group. We're having the first meeting tomorrow where we will have local authority reps. That meeting will also be, it'll be a part 1 and part 2. Part 2 will be the finance part of that. So we've set the forums up now, so I think that will start to happen.
Okay. Should we go into the performance part of this plan?
Thanks, Andrew. The performance section, much like previous years, asks us to make a range of target commitments against 30 or so performance standards. A few changes from previous years, but again, Like previous years, the majority relate to our acute providers, and then there are some targets around mental health and wider primary care or community care commitments. Against those, as you can see in the paper, the vast majority were predicting a compliance trajectory which will form part of our final operating plan submission at the end of March. There are a few areas where we're planning a non-compliant position in spite of our very best efforts to make that reach the various national targets in those areas, and there are one or two areas where we're still subject to further review and discussion with our providers to understand what the best trajectory is we can offer for those areas. To James's earlier point about the alignment, more so than previous, we're working hand in glove with our provider colleagues to ensure that we are fully aligned on our commitments against the performance requirements. So far more joint planning forums, and also jointly trying to understand the underlying demand and capacity or service development requirements needed to deliver against the various performance standards. In terms of the areas where we haven't yet reached final agreement, the two or three to call out are the A&E target at St George's. There are two trajectories we're talking to St George's about at the moment, and we look to conclude that within the next few days. The referral to treatment target, the 18-week target, we're working with George's to further understand some of the backing assumptions down to specialty level about how the performance will be delivered across the year for patient waiting times. And in terms of the 52-week waiters, we know that St George's are about to have their first set of data published later this month for waiting times, having had a few years non-reporting. There are some 52-week waiters that they are predicting will move over post-April into the new financial year. And again, we're seeking to have as few people as possible wait over 52 weeks for care at St George's. So that trajectory again is subject to ongoing discussion and review ahead of final agreement at the end of March. There are one or two other areas that we are continuing to focus on. So personal health budget is stated as non-compliant in this paper. Things have moved on since the paper was drafted, and for Merton we now think, because of some other work we've been doing very recently, that we can realistically look to meet a compliant trajectory. So I think with each area where we are non-compliant or subject to ongoing review, we are seeking to get the most ambitious yet deliverable plan for each of those. And for personal health budgets, we think we've now got that one over the line. And within those compliance trajectories, there are some that we've delivered for a number of years consistently without any problem. And as the governing body will well know, there are some that have been very challenging or underperforming this year, where we're seeking to be fully compliant next year. So again, although some are listed as compliant, and we believe we do have credible plans to back that up, there are clearly some areas of challenge in and amongst those 30 or so indicators. But going forward, we've now got another couple of weeks to get to a final position, particularly on some of those outstanding points with St George's, and then the performance trajectories will be set for the year and will be measured against them from our regulator, and the governing body will get their monthly update on progress against them.
Thank you, John. So before I see if anyone else has got a question, let me ask mine, which is in terms of how we're being measured on our performance, the three you particularly flagged up where we're non-compliant seem to be a bit dependent on St George's. But are you just talking there about the St George's performance data, or the performance of the services we're commissioning for the population of Merton? Because obviously the St George's numbers are only, 40% of our Merton activity. So what are we actually talking about when we're looking at the performance?
So the St George's elements around A&E and R&T. We're talking about the trust position. So the way in which we're measured is twofold. We're measured through the lenses of the improvement assessment framework, which looks at that whole range of things about how we're delivering as a CCG. In terms of the annual operating plan, there are some provider level trajectories. So A&E is an example of a provider level trajectory that we as Merton and Wandsworth need to agree with our lead provider. St George will be measured against that, but we need to agree that in conjunction with them. For RTT, clearly there's a huge number of commissioners, including all the tertiary commissioners who interact with St George's, but again as lead commissioner. So Wandsworth technically is lead commissioner, but Merton and Wandsworth working together as a shared management team, we are agreeing against the RTT ambition, against the 52-week wait position. When you go down into some of the more local areas like personal health budgets, for example, there is an explicit target for the population of Merton. For IAPT, for mental health, there are particular targets, national targets that the Merton service needs to deliver. Slightly different, that there are some where Wandsworth is technically the lead commissioner, but given our joint working and the fact there is a material impact for the population of Merton, it is a provider target with the lead commissioner agreeing that.
Yeah, just really good to hear that you've got a plan for personal health budgets. Just as you mentioned the numbers, this is a significant increase from where we are now. Are you confident that, presumably through continuing healthcare processes and others, that we can significantly move that forward, because it's been dragging on for a little while now?
I'm confident we're doing more work now to pressure test these assumptions around how we're going to deliver against personal health budgets, because you're right that there's been a lead in time as we've moved to a new process. I think the previous process did need full reform, and I think part of the reason numbers have been so low is because the team has been set up and established to deliver this on an ongoing, sustainable basis. I've got the breakdown of how we get to those numbers against the various elements that can contribute to personal health budget, and on effectively an element by element basis, we're looking over this period of time ahead of the late March final submission to make sure that we aren't being in any way overly optimistic, and we are putting a realistic trajectory in at this stage. I think there's always clearly some significant pressure that comes down the line in any area where we plan not to achieve the minimum national standard. We now are over that line, but I don't want us to be overly ambitious. So just in the last 24 hours, we've moved to where we think we can be compliant, but we are continuing to test that.
I think it's worth saying on that the prospective number of PHBs that we're being asked to have by NHS England is in excess of all the people in Merton in receipt of full CHC, all the people in receipt of funding for a mental health placement and an LD placement from the CCG, and quite possibly all the people in receipt of funded nursing care as well. So beyond those cohorts where you're doing sort of individual placement type responsibilities, I think the question is, what is a personal health budget? And I think the degree to which you have a conversation with somebody that personalises their care and talks about the resources that they're entitled to and how they would like to be arranged, and when that becomes a personal health budget, is something that we're working through with other partners, because I think it's been interpreted quite differently in different places.
I would absolutely agree. I think we need to be very careful that you don't overextend the interpretation of a personal health budget, and being really clear about giving people control. But it is something that's been grappled with across the country over the last 4 or 5 years. So, looking at what happens elsewhere, I think is probably really helpful as well.
Andy, do you want to come in?
Hi, John. I just wanted to ask a question about the line where it says percentage of the population with access to online consultation. Does that relate to primary care, secondary care, both? And is it just access? And how would we measure that?
It relates to primary care. I'll hand over to Katie if she wants to say anything more.
So it does relate to primary care, and it's on a practice by practice basis. So we have to be able to confirm that by whatever the trajectory is. Sorry, I haven't got the page in front of me, that we do have that compliance.
And thank you. And what does online mean? Do you know what the criteria are for that?
So it will be it will be the DoctorLink software rollout that we're currently undertaking across Merton practices that will make us compliant.
Okay, thank you.
So, any other questions? We're going to, the final 2 sections were for noting, but provide the context for the commissioning intentions, which is the thing that we actually need to formally approve as a governing body. So, are there any other questions that people want to ask before we come to making a decision?
it was just one thing. I was quite pleased this year because there's been a lot of stuff in the child mental health, particularly in those sorts of gaps that I know as a GP that we've been battling with for some years. So it's really good to see those gaps filled. I just wondered about the identification of gaps going forward and what we may, or where we may think we've still got places to fill, either from our secondary care providers, gaps in primary care services, other things. It's what, you know, what we do next almost.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that we have a process every year to review data on service provision, where we're doing well and where we aren't. We have engagement sessions on the commissioning intentions. We talk to localities, we talk to patients. I think that you see a very significant increase in investment in mental health, and particularly children and young people's mental health, which, you know, one of the benefits of working across Merton and Wandsworth is that we can look at some of the things that have happened in other boroughs and say, well, actually, should we do that in a Merton context as well? So, you know, I think it's that annual, that quite well embedded in our process of engagement around the commissioning intentions every year that means that we target the right things going into the year. I think if there's something absolutely specific that we're aware of, then that can come up at any time, because the earlier that we can start planning, the better, really.
Could I just go back to the finance question and your point about reducing dependence on others in terms of achieving our QUIP end? Is there a move away from payment by results and get block contracts in these commissioning intentions?
So in short, yes, that's the aspiration. That's part of what we're trying to grapple with. But we won't achieve the aims of system working by remaining on in a PBR regime. So I think at the moment we're in a bit of a, we're neither one thing or the other, but I think that's the aspiration, is to move away from that. And my personal opinion is it's the only way that we're going to probably get to a system-wide working position, by moving away from it.
Okay, are we in a position then to approve the commissioning intentions? Is everyone happy to do that? Can you indicate your content to approve? Yes? Excellent. Okay, so we've approved the commissioning intentions. Thank you very much for that. I thought it was a helpful discussion. So we're going to go on to the strategy and planning section, the first item of which is on the primary care contract. Katie.
Thank you very much. So just to kick off with a bit of an apology to those who were at the Merton Health and Care Together board yesterday, and all the GPs in the room who are living and breathing this, because I know you'll have heard my spiel already. But this document attempts to provide the governing body with a summary of the changes that are set out within the 5-year framework for GP contract reform, which was published last month. It represents a really significant shift in the way that primary care operates and will be commissioned going forwards. And we're still working through what this means for us locally in Merton. There is further detailed guidance to back up the document due to be published later this month, which we hope will clarify a number of different areas. Importantly, the changes do come with significant new investment, again to be worked through exactly what we'll be receiving locally and where it will be received, but a large proportion of that new investment will be going to the creation of a new network DES that will see practices coming together in groups of 30 to 50,000 registered population to implement a number of changes, including the introduction of a number of new staffing roles, so physicians' assistants, social care, social prescribing advisors, and also clinical pharmacists as well. Also important to note that the contract talks about the alignment of community services staff, mental health staff and social care staff with these new networks, which is obviously going to be crucial when we're talking at the Merton Health and Care Together forums and things like that with the council in the room, to take into account how that might impact on wider services. And there's also the appointment of a clinical director for each network as well, with the ambition that that clinical director will have a role feeding into those local transformation conversations, and we'll obviously need to work through how the governance of that will fit with our existing structures. Clearly this is a huge opportunity to drive forward the primary care transformation agenda in terms of improving the resilience and sustainability of our practices, in terms of developing the capacity of primary care to manage increased demand and shift of care from hospitals as well, and also, as I say, to drive forward that integration agenda that we're already starting to explore. Merton has made significant progress already in forming these primary care networks. We're absolutely not starting from scratch here. In fact, we're ahead of many other South West London boroughs. We have 4 robust primary care networks that are already in operation, and we'll be working with the Federation colleagues, our colleagues at the LMC as well, to make sure that we can ensure that those network arrangements are submitted within the deadlines that are set out in the contract. Other changes that are described in the contract include a number of revisions to the existing quality and outcomes framework, which incentivises quality improvement across GPs and is set at a national level. There's also a number of workforce development initiatives which really build on work that's been done in previous years. And there's further emphasis on the development of digital in primary care, which again Merton is on the front foot with in terms of things like rollout of Dr. Link across the borough this year. So just in terms of next steps, I alluded to the fact that there is a deadline for the formation of primary care networks. So practices have to come back to us with their proposed networks by the 15th of May, which isn't that long a turnaround time. And then the CCG has a role in approving the formation of those networks as well, which we have to have done by the 31st of May. So we will be working with our primary care committee in order to make sure that that is able to be scheduled in and is done in a smooth manner. But I think it's fair to say that I'm confident, given the progress that we've already made in developing the primary care network arrangements, that we will be in a position to meet those deadlines, albeit there may be some minor changes that we need to take into account. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Katie. So, Karen, do you want to say something further?
Yeah, just
particularly in your
to the timetable. Do we have a feel yet for how extensive any variation to the contracts will need to be, and whether that's going to take time for practices to take advice, etc.? Do we have a feel for that yet or not?
So we don't. It's a question I've asked of the NHS England team in South West London, so we'll hope to come back with some news on it soon.
Claire?
I mean, this is a very exciting development, and the new roles sound very interesting. Where and how are they going to be trained and found?
I think that's a really good question. So I guess on a specific level, so as you know, we have a very successful social prescribing programme already running in Merton. So I think we have ways and means to actually roll out those that scheme into the practice networks, or indeed into individual practices very, very rapidly. The remainder of the roles are actually coming in online over a period of time, I presume, because there will be sort of a national push to train more clinical pharmacists, because we know at the moment, even with the pilots that are currently ongoing, or the bids that have come in to be a pilot site for clinical pharmacists, there is a shortage. So I think with that, we are very much relying on working with partners within South West London, so university trusts and the Health Education England, to make sure that actually we take advantage of those new posts and make sure that Merton is a receptive place that people will want to come and work.
And how soon will they be able to start? I mean,
So in terms of social prescribing, I believe there's actually a deadline in here that it comes in sooner rather than later. I don't want to tell you something. It is, yeah.
Social prescribers and clinical pharmacists.
Okay, thank you.
And then the other roles that phased over subsequent years.
So I think, again, with this, probably some of the devil is in the detail, and we're waiting for some further information to be published around it. I think we will be starting conversations with our local CPNs to understand where those, particularly the pharmacist roles, will come from. So watch this space.
Can I just chip in, sorry, just to follow up on that around, so there's been the first contact practitioner pilot happening in Wandsworth, but it's also just on the workforce bit, conversations we can be having with acute trusts around, for example, physio roles, how we work with our partners to think about how resources deployed, etc. as well. So it may not need to be completely new.
Thank you. Can I just say, I know that some of our practices already have links with local university around training some of the other roles like physicians, assistants and paramedics. I think the ideal thing would be we train people in Merton, and Merton is attractive, and they then want to stay, because what you don't want is to train people and then they immediately leave. So I think it's it's how we actually not only train people, but it's how we also retain them within our borough.
So let's bring in Sam and then David and then Tim.
Yeah, just on that point.
Marek,
Yes, sorry about that.
did you want to come in on this?
Yes, I mean, you mentioned, Claire asked, I think, a really important question is about how we make sure that people are trained, but also how we actually bring them in. And one of the big new concepts is, of course, to have all the extra primary care staff coming in, and of course all the PCNs will be competing basically with one another. And you mentioned about Merton being particularly attractive for people to come and work, and I think that's got to be a really fundamental part of this, of the whole strategy, is to make Merton attractive. The major problem I'm sure that you're aware of is that there are a large number of GPs who are intending to retire within the next 5 years or so, and this desire to retain or attract will need to also pertain to GPs very much, because that is a crunch that is coming that I don't think is yet fully appreciated. The government previously promised 5,000 new GPs. I'm not going to ask whether we're anywhere near on target for that, because I know what the answer to that is.
Okay, so Sam.
Just making the point around the non-medical clinical leadership that needs to be clearly visible and developed in this, and working across, and sorry, I know that I've said this to you before, but working across provider boundaries in terms of new ways of employing and supervising and clinically leading developing roles, because that work's already going on in community providers and others.
Yeah.
Sam, I think you're right, and we are, I think, in a lot of these areas, we are in a good position in Merton. As a CCG, we've been rolling out a clinical leadership programme, and it hasn't just been GPs going on it, we've got nurses on it as well, which I think is really positive. And it hasn't just been CCG people, some of the new PCN clinical directors are on our leadership programme, so I think we're doing the right thing to start to build that capacity, so I feel quite positive about that. David?
A couple of questions actually, and a more general comment. On the primary care networks, and the bit that's in the paper, and it does talk about each network has a clinical director and then as its accountable leader. So it'd be helpful if you say a bit more about what does that look like? So accountable for what, to whom, and how, you know, so how is that going to fit within our governance structures? So that's my first one.
You might end up asking questions to which there isn't yet an answer,
yes,
but
exactly.
keep going.
Yes, right. So that's the first. The second one, I think it was similar to where Marek was at. That, you know, there's a big, it's the workforce, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot. It promises a lot, but you know, and where are these people? How are we going to recruit them? So that whole issue around where's the workforce plan that actually backs up delivery of this. And then I guess my more general comment, which I'd be interested in hearing from the GPs on the board. Well, you know, well, what's your reaction to this? I mean, do you see it? Maybe there are different views, as there would be with GPs, but a sense of is this seen as something that's generally welcomed as a, you know, so you know we were talking in Tim just before we started around, you know, the number of changes that have gone on in the NHS. So, you know, what is the reaction from GPs to this?
So let's, Katie, maybe if you want to try and answer the first two parts, and then I'll open it up for free-for-all GP comment.
I'm trying to sound not like a broken record because I kept having to say this morning as well, but there is a lot of detail missing from what's come out in the framework so far, one of it being what the expectations might be of this new clinical director role. We do understand they'll be expected to feed into local transformation. Again, we need to work through as a CCG and probably with the Federation in terms of the clinical leads that we already have, both at the CCG and in the Federation, what that looks like. But watch this space, essentially. In terms of the workforce plan, again, apparently a workforce plan is forthcoming. I suspect it will build on the various initiatives that have been running across London by Healthy London Partnership over the last few years. I think it's a really interesting challenge, and one that we probably do need to get to grips with locally, particularly in the context of the conversation we're going to have later about St George's clinical strategy, because I think there's probably an opportunity to look at how we join up those plans across other providers, so CLCH, social care, primary care, and St George's as well, particularly given that they have the university at hand. So I think there's something about working together to address that too.
James, did you just want to build on that?
Yeah, just on the governance point, I mean, I think that in technical terms, what an accountable clinical leader means is still detail that's to come, as Katie said. I think that, you know, with the work we've been doing through Merton Health and Care together, I think we can, as a health and care system, begin to have some expectations for ourselves of their way of working with the rest of the system, and you know, the kind of culture that we're building in terms of joint agency working and what we expect them to fit in within. I think it's really helpful that we've got a GP Federation board, which is basically comprised of 4 PCN directors already, because there are, you know, already there are people, and we can't presume that they will be the same people. We've already got people representing 4 localities who are used to sort of joint and shared decision making, and I think it's now, you know, my expectation of those accountable clinical leaders is that they act within a wider health and care context at borough level, really, and they're part of our system leadership.
And before I open it up more widely, I mean, I would absolutely agree with that. And in terms of how do GPs react, I think from GPs within the CCG perspective, I don't think this was particularly surprising what's in there. It was a little bit surprising perhaps how quickly, but it is what we've already been working on, and we took a strategic decision when we were looking at primary care transformation and development. Rather than recruiting more GPs into CCG lead roles to support the development of primary care, we said let's focus on the fact that we are that the Federation is starting to create clinical leads for each of the PCNs, and it's part of the shift towards integrated care partnerships within an integrated care system, that a lot of the development of of new pathways and transformation increasingly is going to be led by the providers, and I think that's what we're seeing as part of this shift, really. So I don't see it as particularly deviating from where we thought we were going, but I'll open it up more widely. Tim, go on.
Just a couple of things. First thing was Marek covers the workforce, and we've got a lot of other skill mixes here, and I was just bringing those in actually to plug the gap of retirements rather than actually what we want to do, which is enhance the array of skills that are currently available. So I think we need to be aware of that. Secondly, I've completely lost my thought now. It was on David's of accountability of organisations. I think each of the networks will probably develop in their own ways, and some may build a much more integrated sort of business model as a group, which perhaps you might see at East Merton, compared to the sort of lighter touches networks that you might see in West because of other structural. And I'll have to come back and think there was something else I wanted to say, but I can't completely forget what it was.
Why don't I let's go round, and whoever wants to respond to David can. Andrew.
Yeah, I think it has been coming in Merton, much more so, say, than Wandsworth, where the GP Federation was much more mature, whereas the Federation in Merton has arisen really through the desire to have primary care networks. I think it will allow people to properly look at population-based healthcare, so look at the needs of that population and tailor it, which will hopefully be of benefit given Merton has widely different demographics in different parts of the borough. I think we do need to think carefully about where the governance sits, because in the long-term plan, GP federations aren't mentioned. So we have to look at how networks then relates to the South West London structure that will be there, and how that governance sits within that South West London structure, because they talk about place and system. So I think that is something that needs to be worked through, especially with the changes over the next 12 months. But I think broadly it's been positive within Merton. Yeah.
Tim, you've remembered your third
point. Was the IT element is demand versus need, and we've just there was quite a lot of nervousness about the accessibility of some of the AI tools, those first symptom checkers, and then the prompting that may lead you on to different services, but primarily a lot of those referrals will end up back with the GPs in one form or another. And so I think there is some anxiety about some of the tools that are making patient access easier, which is great for the patients, but mindful of a workforce that is already stressed, and then they're asking us to do video consultation models as well. there's quite a lot of changing. There'll be an increased workload, not always by the people who most need it, and that may serve to build additional pressure at a time when we may not be able to cope with it. So just mindful of that.
So you've had a response from GPs who are sitting in commissioning roles. You've also got Marek here, who's got a representative role for local GPs. So perhaps you'd like to come in.
Thank you, Andrew. So obviously this is indeed, I think the phrase is used, exciting times, and certainly this is a sea change. I mean, it's a massive, massive change, and I don't think everybody really quite appreciates how significant this change is going to be. It's probably the biggest change affecting primary care since the development of partnerships, as opposed to single-handed practices. And there are a lot of governance issues that are still completely unknown. How do the PCNs work? Who actually, who's in control, if you like, of all of that? And there is a lot of detail that yet needs to be coming down. It should be borne in mind that the DES and the development of the PCNs is voluntary. It's not mandatory. Practices do not have to take part in this, and they would stand to lose potentially financially if they didn't. I think Merton stands really pretty well in that regard. I think the relationship between general practice and the CCG is good. Certainly I know of areas where it isn't. And I think there's been a lot of effort put in to try to maintain that good relationship. But I agree with Tim, there are challenges ahead, unknowns that we will be trying to deal with. And I'm not going to start talking about known unknowns and unknown unknowns and so on. But some of those are going to be quite significant. And for example, the push for digital it does have me filled with some degree of trepidation, because our IT as it stands at the moment is somewhat dodgy. I'm sure that Andrew would be more than happy to corroborate that with the frequency of times that EMIS goes offline and so on. How that will work with video consultations, the capacity, technical capacity, I think still remains difficult. And of course it's the issue of demand. What demand is going to be generated by all of this? How much are people going to be thinking that they can access just at the drop of the hat? So lots of interesting things coming. Need to be quite carefully thought through. In the future, we will probably look back on this as being a transformative moment, but it's up to us to try to make sure that we do this in such a way as to not disadvantage or damage practices that are really struggling at the moment at times.
Dagmar's been waiting patiently to come in, so let me...
Sorry, and I'm not even a GP. So I just wanted to comment from a public health point of view, because for us it's really music to our ears. And as Andrew oddly already said, from a population health perspective, it's an absolute great moment. So for me, in terms of vision where public health and primary care find common goals, that is the moment now. And looking into the future in terms of a sustainable model that is around health and not just health care, I think primary care is now firmly in the centre of that. It hasn't always been. You will remember when community trusts and social care tried to combine into sort of community social care trusts and fill the out-of-hospital space, they left primary care a bit dotted around. I think this is now primary care is the pivot for community, and for me that is a really great moment. And I think we've got lots of assets in Merton and some visionary leadership that thinks that primary care is actually health care, but also leadership in the community. So that for me is a long-term vision that I would be really keen that the governing body hangs on to.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask one other thing, which you don't see written down when you see all these clinicals, is the role of a sort of management to talk about implementation. Often a lot of these schemes all fall down because they're just not implemented in the right way, or practices are not perhaps supported in the right way to implement these new tools. And I would really stress, and it may be part of the CCG's practice support team that we've got in place that at the moment has been focusing on things like CQC visits and supporting practices in a sustainable way, but looking forward in a sort of more proactive way is getting our practice to engage, some of them more engaged than others, and to implement some of these changes that are coming so they become normal practice and embedded properly. And I think that would be really one of the roles we could take on and help support primary care.
I think that's a really good point, and what I'm increasingly thinking is that we may need some time before our next primary care committee to sit down perhaps in a seminar type forum to work some of those things through and how we might support practices to create those arrangements. Again, it's all pending publication of further information, but I think that might be a valuable thing to put in place. So perhaps Claire and I will have a chat.
I think that would be a very good idea, and I wouldn't wait for the further publication. For me, there's probably two really critical things to do there. One is about thinking about roles. So what in the new world is the role of the CCG in the development of primary care? What's the role of the Federation? What's the role of the LMC? What will be the role of individual PCNs and even individual practices? And that really needs a bit of thought. And how we then align put the resource in the right place for that as well. And then the other thing is probably quite quickly coming up with some priorities that we need to focus on. Workforce seems an obvious one, where if we get ahead of the curve, we'll put ourselves in a really good position to get the people into those roles in time. So, I mean, we're not going to fix that here, but I do think that suggestion of a further kind of focused seminar would be really helpful. So let's go back round. Karen and Andrew both waiting to speak. So
I think just going back to your question on workforce, I think the expansion of the workforce is obviously welcome, and the expansion of the roles. I think one point that hasn't been raised is actually that there needs to be a lot of public education, and actually also education amongst GPs about what these roles are and how patients can use them to their benefit. And actually, I think also Merritt mentioned the sea change. I think there really is a sea change for how GPs work. And I think a lot of GPs haven't realised that we perhaps should be now focusing much more our skills where they're really needed on the complex patients. And we're not going to get all these additional skills and staff and still be carrying on seeing people with sore throats and whatever. I think that hasn't actually been verbalised, but actually we need to change the way we work and where our focus and energies and skills go. And let some of the other people that are coming in use their skills to deal with those other cases. So we can't carry on doing everything like we always have. We've got to let a lot of it go and refocus. That's my personal view.
Andrew?
From a public perspective, it's yet another layer within a very complex system. And I guess the question I've really got is how visible this new setup is actually going to be. I mean, it's going to suit a lot of professionals. It's going to be very bureaucratic in its structures, and it's have a very clear sense of management in the word with a big M. But I wonder how far the public will ever get to understand something as complex as this, because it's not only a different way of working, it's also a different conceptual idea. And, if I try to put myself in the place of a member of the public, how would you get to understand it? And your point really about, how much effort are we going to have to make sure people have any idea what the hell's going on?
I think broadly you're right. I mean, in that I'm not sure that we know yet how much visibility PCNs will have to the public. But I'm not sure that they will be an excessively managerial or bureaucratic structure, though. I think that actually, there's going to be some funding that comes down to support PCNs in running PCNs, but I think it'll be relatively light. I think that what it will be is basically some backfill GP time to a great extent. And I think local practice management will play a role as well. I think it will put a different set of drivers on the skill set within practice management, and I think that practice management is quite variable in terms of what practice managers are asked to do depending on the size and nature of a practice. So I'm not sure that this is necessarily another enormous bureaucratic layer. I think it will be that form will follow function in terms of what PCNs need to do. I also think that PCNs may choose to have a discussion with other bodies. So we just had a discussion about the CCG supporting PCNs potentially, if we're asked to, because that I think will need to partly come from the PCNs. But also PCNs may choose to have a discussion with their GP Federation about using some of the existing infrastructure that's already been built up over the last couple of years, where the Federation, whose board is based around 4 PCN directors, already has quite a bit of that in place. So, not quite sure about the visibility of PCNs, not quite sure that they're either going to have the resource or the inclination to build a sort of whole new layer of bureaucracy.
So, What I'm going to do, Katie, is save you to the end and allow you to sum up and respond to the next couple of comments. I think a room with so many GPs in talking about primary care, we could well go on into the evening and still not feel satisfied. So what I'm going to do is just limit it to maybe two or three more comments, if we can make those, and then Katie, I'll get you to sum up, and then we'll move on to the NHS long-term plan, which isn't just about primary care. So Claire, Andy, Tim, and then Katie's going to close for us.
I think the challenge is going to be in communicating to patients that they won't be seeing a GP. I think beyond that, patients are very happy, the public, we are very happy to be treated wherever and however. But I think it's the GP bit that's going to be the real critical issue. And if you look at Harry, people go to Harry, they go through the whole process and they think it's wonderful. And they don't particularly think, oh, I've been to see this person, this person, this person, and this person. It's just how it now is. But I think the critical bit is going to be the GP not seeing the GP.
Thank you, Andrew. It was just a suggestion. The NAPC, which is National Association of Primary Care, have their primary care home is an authorised form of a primary care network. And on the NAPC site, they've got videos of how primary care homes work within population groups, and they're only short, and they're actually very good. So you can see from a patient and a professional perspective on how things work within a network. So that might be helpful if we can direct people to that.
Okay. Tim?
Just to very quickly answer your question, I hope if we did this brilliantly, the patient wouldn't know anything about this going on. That's what I'd really like. What I do like is things like some of the IT where we're going to standardise and maybe upgrade all the websites so we have a much more streamlined, similar path of how a patient navigates through their experience per practice. Now, we all do things slightly differently, but the idea being, particularly with some of the models we're looking for, our website redesign for all of the federation and our practices within it. So I'm rather hoping the education will come from the GP, which is, yes, we have got a clinical pharmacist here in the next room. Perhaps on Thursday you book in for a medication review with them. We'll start this very slow drawl of actually what you expect when you see a GP practice. The new website and the design to navigate people to different services within the practice, but people still go to travel clinics, they still have their smear, they come and have their vaccinate. You know, so they are used to seeing different people in practices, and some bigger the practices have had social prescribing for longer and other things. So I think that'll come, but I hope the PCN would not be visible at all to the public and it runs smoothly as they know they've got their place of care, GP surgery, and I hope it would be fairly seamless to them.
Sorry, Katie, final comment from Marek.
Sorry. Yeah, I think probably one of the biggest challenges is going to be around the concept of continuity of care. This used to be very much based on personal knowledge of the GP and the GP having personal knowledge of his or her patient list. And that has had to change. That no longer is there as it was. And I think what we will need to instill, both within practitioners, but also with other parts of the primary care team, as well as in the patient population, is that continuity of care will no longer necessarily mean seeing the same face across the table from you, because that simply is not going to be feasible. And if we can implement this properly, making sure that people understand that they're still being looked after in a personal way, then it will succeed. But it does need to be proper. It needs to be adequate sort of amount of proper patient and GP education, because we don't want to let go. We like seeing the occasional sore throats and so on as a respite from more complicated things on occasion.
So, Katie, you're going to sum up in response and maybe just set out a couple of next steps that you've identified.
Yes, thank you, Andrew, for that. That's really appreciated. So I think, in summary, there is a lot more we need to work through, and there's still a lot of moving parts at the moment. I think Next steps are, I think we absolutely need some sort of workshop, seminar type forum, probably with key members of the primary care committee round the table to start to work some of this through, particularly, as Marek put it, in terms of identifying what some of the known unknowns might be. Particularly workforce has come up as being an issue, and I think at least if we can get them, all of those known unknowns into one place, we can start to think through how we mitigate them and what things we need to be doing now in order to manage the challenges later on. So we can absolutely do that. There's obviously the very practical bit of making sure that the submissions from PCNs come in within the deadlines and that we are in a position to approve them as a CCG. So we will be working with the Federation and with the practices to make sure that happens, and also to facilitate and mediate if any issues do come up, which I'm really hoping they won't, but I think we've just got to bear in mind that there may be things we need to work through. So I think there's a supportive role for us there, just making sure we're talking to the practices to work that through. The other bit that I'm very aware needs to happen, and it was mentioned, is a contractual piece around what happens with the GMS, PMS contracts, but also the implications of the other things that are set out within this contract above and beyond the practice network bit, which is obviously the most exciting bit, but just to make sure that where there may be overlap with existing services or planned investments, for example, that actually we've worked that through, we're not duplicating, etc., etc. So I think those are three key things.
Thank you. So, well done. That was a really interesting item to look at, and lots more to be done on that. Right, let's go on to the NHS long-term plan. James, this is you.
Yeah, so what I'm not proposing to do is go slide by slide through this slide pack, which has been written by the South West London Health and Care Partnership team, so that we can brief governing bodies and other stakeholders. I think that obviously you will be aware of some of the high-level messages from the long-term plan around committing the investment that the government has committed to the NHS, about there needing to be a balance between commitment to new transformation versus fixing some of the financial problems that exist in the system already, and certainly in 2019-20 there are certainly parts of our South West London system that are benefiting from some non-recurrent funding to help resolve historic deficits. So that is a key feature of the funding, certainly in the short term, but we know that more transformation funding will be released over the life of the long-term plan to deliver some of the commitments made in here. When we did a piece of work to look at our commissioning intentions and our Merton Health and Care Together priorities against the long-term plan, we identified absolutely huge overlap, and it was quite reassuring really to know that actually many of the areas that we've identified to work on as a borough are already the things that were identified in the long-term plan, and it kind of is a credit to the document that it is very much based on conversations with systems such as ours about how the system needs to evolve. And that really informs how we're responding to the long-term plan as a South West London system. So we will be asked for a response in the autumn, and the proposal is that the response for South West London to the long-term plan is an aggregation of the 6 borough local health and care plans with some cross-cutting clinical transformation priorities, where either work needs to be done at a higher than borough level because of the nature of a priority, so for example cancer, or that there are areas where the borough plan doesn't quite meet the requirements. So I think that I'll take it as read. I'm happy to take any questions on the detail. I think what's quite encouraging is that as a South West London system, we are in a position to respond to this in a way that's very real, being developed with partners on a bottom-up basis, and is aligned to what we were planning to do anyway for the most part. I think there will be some areas that are sort of relatively new, certainly to some areas, and where they will need to develop new plans, but I think that they will actually be relatively limited. I think what's really important is that as a system we get good at securing some of the funding that's going to be available for this, and actually I think that's something that we, with the recent Trailblazer application and other applications, I think we've proven ourselves to be quite good at recently. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Sam?
you're talking about the borough focus. I guess it's the engagement of the local authority at this point, because prevention programmes will sometimes be public health led, sometimes be primary care led.
So, I mean, what works well for us in terms of our borough level arrangements is the considerable engagement of CCG staff in the health and wellbeing strategy in a number of prevention initiatives. So we're working across public health, children's services, social prescribing and other services on basically a single framework for signposting, because we realised we were developing signposting directories in multiple different places, and also beginning to work through how we potentially could commission some public health services alongside, for example, community services in the future, because we've got an opportunity of a number of contracts coming up at the same time. I think what's less clear from there's two things that are less clear from the plan. The first is how we understand the potential future funding of social care, as I've already alluded to. Most local authorities don't have clarity around that beyond 2021, which is when the current sources of additional funding run until, in terms of Better Care Fund and IBCF. We were expecting a social care green paper, it hasn't turned up yet. I think the other one is there are commitments to CCG-led healthy lifestyle public health initiatives within the long-term plan, and what we are needing to work through is how they sit alongside local authority public health commission services, because they are now quite variable, and actually there are some local authority public health commission services that actually largely meet the requirements of what's in the long-term plan. Others are not quite at that place anymore, so potentially the CCG and local authority will need to work together on bolstering some of that provision. So but I'm confident that and I'm sure Dagmar will have a view, but I think we work really closely together on the interface between public health and prevention and CCG commission services.
Dagmar, would you like to
If I just add, so details do need to be absolutely thrashed out, but we had already a bit of a discussion even in our clinical senate, and Vin was there as the medical director from London. So a number of really high impact evidence-based healthy lifestyle support embedded in pathways. The blueprint business template lends itself to be developed at London or at least regional level, because they go across right from primary care into the acute services and back. And so what we're envisaging and have discussions at London level as well is to focus on a few high impact ones and give the STPs the help to implement across. So I think it's actually a real huge opportunity to scale up a few high impact ones properly.
Andrew, did you want to say?
I guess probably you have a better idea than most to be able to clarify one of the points, which is the aim to have to support diversity and a culture of respect and treatment, fair treatment. I mean, it seems to me that that's one of those hidden details that it really does represent stuff that gets forgotten. And I wonder what you feel is involved in actually doing something about that, as opposed to writing down the words.
It's a really interesting point, and I think it will differ by organisational context. I think that for many, this will be about tackling issues of workforce diversity and fairness, and things like our ability to ensure that our senior leadership in NHS organisations is reflective both of the whole workforce and also the communities we serve. And that's a challenge that many NHS organisations face, and that was highlighted when we looked at our EDS report at the last governing body. I think that also, in terms of a culture of respect and fair treatment, there is something within that comes out of the way the NHS management system behaves towards itself sometimes. So I think that can mean different things to different people in different contexts. I think the overall challenge for the clinical workforce is to ensure that we really do embed equal treatment and diversity, and that we, as I say, begin to become a little bit more reflective as leadership of our systems and communities. But I think there are numerous different aspects, and I know that one of them is also around the approach towards culture within NHS management as well.
If I just supplement on that, it seems to me we know that things like NDAs and non-disclosure agreements have been criticised quite seriously for preventing people from speaking up or saying where things are wrong. And what we know from what happens elsewhere is it is actually quite a difficult problem to actually tackle, to actually deal something about it. And as I said to you before, that it's nice to have the words down there, but unless there's a real significant effort, not much will change. And I just wonder whether there'll be a sufficient structure to actually tackle that thing with any systematic effort.
I mean, I think that in terms of approaches towards managing clinical quality risks, I do think that post mid-staffs and the Francis report, and also with the implementation of the new junior doctors contract and the very difficult times that as a system we had around that, I think there have been a number of measures put in place. So, when we have recently been talking about some of the challenges we've had around sort of following people through in certain acute providers and making sure they get their appointment, we've been talking about our duty of candour and making sure that we're talking to people about when things have gone wrong, and that's been embedded into some of the processes that we've had. You will see across, that's embedded across acute trust. You'll also see guardians of safe working hours for junior doctors embedded as well, and a number of increased safeguards. I think that there are areas that go beyond pure clinical quality and safety where we can do more around our culture, but they will need some working through. So I think the system is on the way towards tackling some of the things. I think it needs to start with clinical quality risks first, and that was why we had such an extensive response as a system to what happened at mid-staffs, because we needed to know we could put in systems and processes where people could call out clinical safety risks. And certainly I think the governance in the provider sector has improved significantly, and we have quite strong quality governance processes within the CCG as well, which link into the contractual requirements we put on providers. I suppose that there's the wider piece outside of clinical quality as well.
Sorry, am I on? I was just going to add that we do now have a South West London organisational development group that's led by Karen, where we are looking at things in regards to duty of candour and speak up guardians within the CCGs themselves, so that staff do feel that they can have those conversations, and looking at fair recruitment, unconscious bias and all of that sort of thing. There's a whole plan of work that's happening at the moment, and it's probably, on reflection, it's probably worth bringing some of that to the governing bodies in the future, so that you're aware of the work that's going on, because there's a monthly meeting, there's quite a lot of work that we've done probably in the last 6 months that maybe the governing body isn't so cited on, so we can do that.
Anything else? I think part of the lack of challenge does reflect what you said, which is I think our local plans are very much aligned with what's come out in the long-term plan, and also the work we've been doing at South West London is also very much in line with this. And I think it's credit to the work we've done locally to be thinking forward and getting ourselves in the right place strategically, but also credit to the way it's been done in terms of, it's absolutely right, they have really engaged with local systems in creating this, so I think that's very encouraging. Okay, so that was for information. Let's go on then to the next section, which is some standing items. We've got the finance report, which is for information. Neil, did you want to just summarise this for us?
Yeah, so not a great deal more to add. So the position hasn't changed since I last reported back to the board. All the areas have remained reasonably stable. We've got year-end agreements in place with Epsom St Helier and with Kingston Hospital, so that limits some of the risk around those contracts. And we're very close to an agreement with St George's, which I hope to conclude by the end of this week. The value of that year-end settlement is within the numbers that we're currently forecasting for that contract. So, in short, all of the areas pretty much as they were before. We're on target to achieve the surplus that we've set, and just to note that that underlying recurrent deficit, I'll keep mentioning it so everybody is absolutely clear about it as we move into 1920. Happy to pick up any comments from the report.
David, do you want to say anything?
Well, really, there isn't much to add. I mean, I won't repeat what Neil has said. I mean, we've been through the detail at the Finance Committee, so we've scrutinised it. I guess the one thing that we could just reflect on is on page 10, which is the risks and mitigations, which we've been tracking through. Quite a number of those that were previously risks have not materialised, because so the number that are now left as risks, because we're almost at that position within the end of the year, aren't there. So I think that's positive. I mean, clearly, what has to be taken forward into next year's planning is the fact that when you look on slide 8, which is the spend against plan, as we know, the big overspend is around acute commissioning. And again, that's one of the areas that's been picked up in terms of the plan for next year. So, but other than that, and we'll continue to monitor and work with Neil and the team.
Any questions on finance? No? Okay, thank you. That was for information. And then we've got the performance report. John.
Thanks, Andrew. I'll take the report as read. Just a couple of areas I wanted to call out. Overall, the position has remained stable against the performance indicators into the most recent reporting period, which is December and occasionally January for some, that's updated more frequently. We know with the IAP target, which talked about length in previous meetings, we're moving to a new provider from the 1st of April, and the mobilisation continues to progress to make that transition from the end of the financial year. A&E and RTT at St George's, which has a significant impact for Wandsworth and a material impact for Merton, continues to play through. I've made some points during the planning item, but the first set of data we'll have nationally published will be on the 14th of March for St George's RTT position. The A&E position slightly above in January this year where it was in the previous January. A number of challenges around maintaining flow at St George's. They've had some spikes in attendances since Christmas. We're looking to see if that is now going to be sustained as a longer term trend, or if that is just an anomaly in this first part of the year, and to set that into the plan for next year if it is indeed likely to be sustained. The recovery rate in IAPT we continue to focus on as our incumbent provider is handing over to the incoming provider. It's not quite 50% and continues to cause some concern. And 2 of the cancer standards in this most recent month didn't achieve the standard. They're both on very small cohorts of patients, and I appreciate that doesn't make it any better in some regard, but the majority of cancer standards are above target. We are focusing now on making sure that the 62-day screening cohort, which is a problem across South West London, 2 out of the 4 going through that pathway were in excess of the 62-day standard, and we're looking at making sure they are not in any way lost as they go through the process of being tracked and treated. But they were the points I wanted to raise. Happy to answer on any points of the report.
Sorry, John, I know this probably bothers you. You did mention it previously, but just being clear of the transition waiting list changeover of our IAPT, because we have been through this in the last few years once before. I think last time you said that we would try and get the incumbent provider to finish off the work it has on its list and allow a fresh start for the new provider. Is that the way it's happening, or are we handing over a big waiting list to the new provider and potentially starting with a similar problem we had when we last did this, where we then have a back up against the wall on day one? I can't quite remember what the update is, and it looked like there were 500 odd people on a waiting list from December. Where are we with that waiting list now, 2 months further on?
So there will be a group of patients that hand over on a waiting list. We're trying to get that to be the fewest possible people on that waiting list. We're agreeing to expand some of the numbers going to the other providers that are currently operating Big White Wall and IESO. I don't have numbers to hand, but I can certainly get you a note after the meeting of what we are aiming to have the residual waiting list at the point of handover. It's being discussed at length in the mobilisation meetings to try and absolutely minimise that and to give the incoming provider the best possible chance of delivery from month 1 onwards.
Because it would be really helpful from the GP for us as locality leads when we go to our next meeting to be able to inform our GP members where we are. It really focuses the conversation you have with the patient as well, and sort of trying to, you're already having that conversation about trying to promote the Big White Wall and IESO, which have been very popular actually for those cohort of patients who want to do it. But there are people who say that's not what they want, and therefore to shoehorn them into other providers that they've already expressed a desire not to be part of from our point of view in our consultations. So it would be really good to have as an up-to-date feel for the information that we can then give our colleagues when we have our next locality meetings and practice leads forum, just so we can get everyone on the right page.
So, Andy, you're our mental health clinical lead. Do you want to
Yeah,
comment?
the mobilisation meetings, we've asked the Trust to come up with a sort of plan on a page with very simple communication around how you access all aspects of that primary care recovery service. It's going to be called Merton Uplift. So that's what it's called, Merton Uplift. So we're hoping to get that out soon so we can then communicate, because IESO will remain but Big White Wall won't. So it's just communicating then how we can access that, and that's what we're planning to do.
And that's going to finish on 1st of April. So it's not long, is it? Yeah. Okay. Marek?
So I just wanted, because of course that's the transition of patients who are on the waiting list. I suppose really I wanted to have the assurance, I think you've already given it before, that people who are actually currently undergoing treatment, their treatment won't suddenly stop simply because there's a termination of that contract. If they still require further counselling sessions or whatever, those will still be provided by the current provider. Is that correct?
There were some questions that I had for AdAction, and John and I have got a meeting set up to see them soon, but one of them is exactly that question, and they have given me a response which I'm happy to share with you about how they will do with each individual and whether they want to opt out and go to the new provider or stay on their current caseload, and I have given an explanation as to how they'll manage that, so I'll share that with you afterwards.
Dagmar?
John, if I can just ask you to comment possibly on the delayed transfers. Just as we're exiting winter, a bit of a reflection how we've managed winter this year, and there seems to be a little blip, but generally we are performing well. It would be helpful if you could sort of give us a summary, because this is quite an important indicator for our joint health and care integration work.
Absolutely. We have an extremely challenging target around detox. The day-to-day process during winter, and a very similar process to last year, is that we have a senior, a member of the senior team effectively on call to deal with any tricky delayed transfers of care that aren't able to be actioned through our usual escalation process. St George's have had remarkably few detox over the winter, and although, as with any provider trust, there are one or two patients who, for various reasons of multiple complexity, end up staying at the provider trust far too long, the vast majority of people have been discharged quickly. Where detox have occurred, they've been dealt with quickly. In terms of our performance position, we certainly have a very difficult target to meet, and we monitor this very carefully. In terms of our adult social care delays, they have been within the target for some time now. With NHS delays, they have been above target, but overall I think Merton does reasonably well in terms of detox.
Any other questions, comments? No? Okay, so that performance report was again for information. Thank you, John. We've got the reports from some of the committees. So we've got the summarised minutes of Finance Committee in common from November, December and January, and summarised minutes from Integrated Governance and Quality Committee. I'm not proposing we go through those. Were there any questions or comments people had on those minutes? No? Okay. So I will go on to any other business, which is also our slot for questions. So are there any questions from members of the public?
Hello. My name is Peter West. I'm the chair of the Lambton Road Medical Practice, PPG, but my questions are not questions that have been generated from a meeting of the PPG. Can I ask two questions? Is that allowed? My first question is, for someone who's written books and government reports on the reorganisations, past reorganisations of the NHS, I recall that one past one, it may have been the last one, was described by the Chief Executive of the NHS as so big it was visible from outer space. This reorganisation that you've described in different ways, and of course the government doesn't want to call it a reorganisation, is potentially bigger because of all the changes that you've touched on in general practice, which to a considerable degree came through relatively unscathed from 1948 to now. I mean, not completely unscathed, but is anyone piloting anything? Are you piloting anything? Are you asking the STP to pilot things? Are you suggesting that NHS England pilots things? Because the history of these changes shows a complete failure to pilot, a determination to achieve success as defined by the government in order to meet some electoral target or something else. I mean, these changes are massive. Are you piloting?
So, I mean, I think that if you look at PCNs, if you look at many of the things that PCNs are proposed to do, we've actually got elements of them happening, if not in Merton, then in Merton and Wandsworth or across wider South West London. So when we were talking about PCNs, I alluded to the fact that our GP Federation, its governance is actually composed of 4 primary care networks in local areas. So we've been working in a PCN approach for some time. So we understand one potential likely geography of PCNs. It might not be the final geography. And we have got used to having networks working together at a local level. And that's not all that unusual. There's been a programme from the National Association of Primary Care called Primary Care Home, which has been rolled out in a number of areas, which has been around networks of 30 to 50,000 GPs as well. So I certainly think that the PCN approach has had a reasonably good airing within the system before it's been committed to policy and committed to a GP contract. Also, some of the actual clinical transformation and transformation to services on the ground, which is envisaged under the GP contracts and under the long-term plan. It's actually based on the experience of what's happened in other places. So the overall approach of forming ICSs and local subsystems that work in an integrated way is based on what's happened with the vanguards that were set up under the 5-year forward view. There's some analysis that supports the relative performance of those vanguards to the rest of the system. And initiatives such as social prescribing, first contact physiotherapy, clinical pharmacists in practice have all had a testing over the last few years. In fact, I suppose from an NHS management perspective, sometimes it's been a little bit difficult to see where the logic's been in terms of some things that have been sort of released to happen in a very small number of areas with non-recurrent funding. We now understand the logic because they're all in the long-term plan with the learning that's been taken from them. So, I think anyone that works in NHS management is inevitably slightly leery about further reconfigurations because we've all been personally reconfigured several times if you've had a decent career in this. But actually, as we've highlighted through the number of things that are in our local plan and also in the long-term plan, actually what's in this long-term plan is pretty much based on a lot of the things that systems were looking to do already. So in that respect, this one does feel like it isn't sort of a massive revolution, and it certainly isn't just a sort of enormous structural change in the way that some of the recent ones have been.
Okay, and just a quick comment on that before I ask my second question. Given what was said earlier about the IT, and given what we know about how people behave, for example, people find it much easier to lie to a computer than to a person. I think the demand implications of something like Dr. Link are potentially enormous. And so there are things there that certainly need to be piloted. If you can tick 11 boxes and be guaranteed an appointment with a GP within a few hours, which is what I understand is one of the possible outcomes, then a lot of people are going to game the system, I think, and get that appointment. Sorry.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
You don't treat that as my second question, that's all right.
No, that's fine. So just on the Dr. Link point, I think a lot of GPs are very worried about that level of demand that it's going to generate. This is one of the things that has been piloted in various areas, including in a number of practices in Wandsworth for a long time. Actually, practices have actually bought it themselves, and they actually think in the slightly longer term it manages their demand back down. So it hasn't been the experience that it actually does increase demand in the slightly longer term, albeit the capacity required to actually implement it properly and get the systems and processes in place in individual practices to make it work properly has been a bit of a one of the things that practices have needed some support with, and so there is some funding that's actually come down alongside the new software rollout to make sure that actually we can help practices with that.
No, just sort of help, just on a practical note, because obviously that's one of my anxieties as a practice GP is what this demand's going to look. You must remember, patients already have the ability to book book an appointment. So most practices Merton have online booking, so patients are already booking without actually asking any symptom checker. They just book an appointment because they feel like it. So that's available to our population, and a proportion of my appointments are available for booking that way, and a proportion are safeguarded and protected for a more triage role, emergency care and whatnot. So I think to a certain degree, I was a bit worried about that, but it is already available. So the gaming bit, and I think the conversations we have is actually how Dr. Link lets us know what is required, and yet a certain amount of control is still within the GP cohort to triage to appropriate. Now that might mean we have to make a phone call to a patient to clarify the symptoms they've put through their system. So I think we've all got to have a little think about how, and it's what we had as a practice yesterday, how we handle the Dr. Link generated work. But yeah, I think that's shared amongst the cohort.
What was your second question?
My second question, I'm sorry, just quickly to respond to that first one, of course, online appointments, the number of online appointments are controlled by the practice. And indeed, given current uptake levels in our practice, affluent, high IT users potentially, surprising how low that figure is. So some of the targets about use of online appointments look incredibly optimistic. Second question, given that you're a bit strapped for cash and so on, I was wondering why you're putting nearly $500,000 into buying a clinical commissioning support system that will steer GPs through all the different guidance, pull together all the different guidance nationally and combine clinical templates and referral forms with local and national guidance. And indeed, given the history of NHS IT, I was a bit surprised that you want it up and running by the 1st of July, given that the tender closed last week, and that indeed that you're keen to accelerate it if possible. It all seemed, I happened to come across this tender, it all seemed to be pretty optimistic.
Yeah, Katie, do you want to answer?
So on that, I don't know where the £500,000 figure has come from. It's definitely
450 something. That's right.
So that's definitely not right. I don't know whether that's the saving that we're anticipating.
It's in the published tender document.
Okay, we may need to look at that and so I think that's over a number of years, and I think that's across Wandsworth and Merton as well. So on an annual basis, it's not that amount. So sorry, that's why I didn't recognise the number. So the clinical decision support software, we already have a tool in place which is not functioning quite as we'd want it to. Essentially, what we're anticipating is this will support GPs to improve the quality of their referrals, so that actually, as a result of that, we reduce the unnecessary appointments that are actually happening in secondary care in outpatients at the moment. So this is one of those schemes where we are anticipating that the cost will be met by reduced costs elsewhere in the system. And also we know that actually by doing that, patients will not be being sent off to George's and St Heliers and wherever else unnecessarily, when actually GPs could be supported to manage their care better in the community through having access to this particular tool.
So are you looking for an off-the-peg tool?
So there are a number of different tools out there that obviously we're exploring through the procurement process which one would be most fit for purpose.
Okay, so you think that the July date is feasible?
We do, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? No? Okay. Well, that moves us on then to date of the next meeting, which is Wednesday, 1st of May, and this time it's at the Chaucer Centre at 2:30. So that's the next meeting. I'll now bring the meeting to a close. So that's the end of our part 1 meeting. I'll give people just a few minutes comfort break, and then we shall reconvene for our part 2 meeting. Let's say at 25 past